Empezaré corriendo antes de que nos cambien de...
I'll quickly start before we change rooms again to make the most of the time available. There's a text from a great pedagogue, Stuart Schenker, who says that we are in the midst of an education revolution. The scientific breakthroughs aim at the same conclusion. The way a student behaves in the classroom depends on how they self-regulate. And I would like you to underline this term. Self-regulation is a more accurate indicator than IQ. And that is where I want to focus the whole presentation. And it's true that I find this moment interesting, confusing, where we have many opportunities, and where, as I explained in an article I published last Sunday in the newspaper El Mundo, at ICOT, I would like us to bring about a change from the world of education. A change in what sense? Education is not receiving from psychology the help it deserves. And I think that from the world of education, we should reformulate most of the things that we are being told from the world of psychology. Psychology doesn't give us a model to be able to orient education, especially at such a time like the present time where things move so quickly, because there has been a spectacular fragmentation, and therefore we don't get a complete picture of the subject. The American Society of Psychology, which is very powerful, it has 54 divisions that don't speak to each other. They have split it up into 54 little parts. They've split up the human being into 54 little parts. And of course, we're talking about integrated education. And to have integrated education, we need to have an integrated model for the human being, how the human being works, how it's structured, where it's going, and how all this is organized. Our pedagogy is cut and paste. And we are working with psychology that I would like to call the Hamburger psychology. First, we cut everything up, and then we paste it together the best we can. If this works, which I doubt, we need a new theory of intelligence. And we need it in education. And in education, we should put pressure on everybody that works on this for a reason I'll explain later. The basic structure of human intelligence depends on education. We are not an add-on. We are what has been shaped by the human species. The human species must be defined not through rationality, which is scarce or suspect, but because it's the only species that educates its offspring. And by educating its offspring, it's producing a prodigious loop. And what the child learns constitutes its intelligence. And this is where human intelligence has emerged and has separated us from animal intelligence. But this is where we have the right, and I think the obligation, of directing the research of all sciences that deal with the human person, because we are in charge of designing what we're going to do in the future with human intelligence. Why? Because education makes the species. This is a quote from Jerome Bruner, which I think is possibly one of the most innovating psychologists in the 20th century. And as he says here, we have fragmented the human being in such a way that now we don't exactly know what to do with it. These are things that can't be exported from one place to another. Each scientific theory on the human being has made a great deal of progress in itself. And it's true that science needs specialization. But it's also true that with that fragmentation, we cannot move forward in the field of education. And it's in education where we need to say, well, we've come this far. Okay, what has been done is extremely valuable, but we need to integrate it somehow. In the 20th century, well, this is the Hamburger Theory, and here we could have behaviorism, then we could have cognitivism, we could have multi-intelligence, emotional intelligence, cognitive skills, intelligence, habits, non-cognitive skills. Yes, we could keep adding layers, but who's going to eat all this? Have you ever tried to eat a hamburger this size? Well, it's quite complicated. And every time something comes up, we can't just add it on. And now, hacking. What's hacking? A learning theory, a learning strategy, a basic learning strategy, a passing fashion. Do we include hacking? What is hacking? What are we talking about when we talk about hacking in education? What are we talking about when we talking about hack your brain? Is that serious? Or is it just something else we can add? Add another layer to the hamburger. When we talk about thinking habits, can that be coordinated with multiple intelligence? Are there thinking habits for each of the multiple intelligences, or is it just another layer? When we talk about non-cognitive skills, what are we referring to? Something that is included in multiple intelligence, thinking habits, emotional intelligence. Everything can be fixed with emotional intelligence. Are we sure? And how do we include emotional intelligence in the curriculum while we add multiple intelligence, while we add thinking habits, at the same time that we add the most powerful learning structure we have, which is the behaviorist? And how do we organize all this? I'll be 76 tomorrow. And that means that at this point, I can be absolutely revolutionary. I don't care. I can say now, for example, that in our department in Madrid, the chair of executive intelligence and education that I run with Carmen Pellicer, and I'm very sorry she's not here, we're working on a model that I think is more powerful than the traditional model that is still being passed on in Harvard, for example. And it's out of date. It's out of date because it was done before neurology took off and before all the theories of artificial intelligence that are going to come into the classroom. Because the problem of the classroom with the new technologies is not do we have a computer or don't we have a computer. No, that's not the point. The point is that the new artificial intelligence models are taking over a significant number of the functions that seem to us to be essential at school. The other day, I was at a meeting of major entrepreneurs that have to do with new technologies. And I was in the car with a young man who was the technical director for one of these companies, and he was talking to me about his children and where they go. And I asked him, have you taken him to a bilingual school? Because this man has spent half his life in the United States, in China, in Germany. And he said, no, I haven't taken him to a bilingual school. You haven't taken him to a bilingual school? No, what for? Well, what for? Well, so that they'll speak English, basically. Well, no, I receive all the updates that Google send me from Google Translator. And these kids are going to have a computer in a couple of years' time that will translate directly into 90 languages using voice in real time. Or why teach them other languages? Well, the fact that the Forbes magazine, a significant number of their articles are written by a computer program and not by them. Well, things are changing very quickly. And we are going so fast that either we stop a moment to ask ourselves what we're doing based on what's happening and put out very long antennas and be smarter than anybody, or the education process is going to be run by the major computer companies because they're very clever, and they have a lot of money. And what they're doing, the education programs being made by Apple, Cisco Systems, Microsoft, Samsung, are very good, very powerful, but they've been made outside the education system. And what's happening with hacking is that somebody is no longer going to consider that it's important to study inside the education system. They're going to go here and there. And that's great, no doubt, but that will be reserved to very few people. And what about our students? What do we do with our students? Do we teach them to say, look, it doesn't matter what your degree is, hack whatever you're interested in? Or do we give them a learning structure that is truly powerful, truly active, that will be useful to face up to a world where we don't know where it's going, but it's going to have two aspects that are absolutely certain. It's going to offer many opportunities, and it's going to be relentless with those that don't make the most of them. And what do we do with those students? That's up to us. And since teachers are the educational conscience of society, we have to watch out for what is best for society in things that have to do with learning. And that means that we need to have much greater responsibility, have study groups in education, and that is why from education is where we should develop an intelligence theory that is powerful enough to be able to resolve many of the education problems that society faces. This is a sort of a very quick map of psychology in the 20th century. Each school of psychology was in charge of something different. The Gestalt psychology, perception psychology, and learning by restructuring information. Will it forward or not? Behaviorism has an extremely powerful learning theory, but it didn't look at consciousness phenomenon because it wasn't considered to be important. However, phenomenology psychology only focused on the consciousness and didn't concern itself with anything else. Cognitivism is in charge of thought, but it wasn't in charge of emotions, for example, or behavior. Emotional intelligence is in charge of emotions, and it provides what it provides. It's in charge of controlling emotions once they have appeared. The model we're going to present is also in charge of how to manage different emotions. I don't know whether to leave it up there. Dynamic psychology was in charge of motivation, but what was considered to be the Bible of motivation, the Symposium on Motivation at Nebraska University in the 70s, they decided to do away with research on motivation because we're not clear. And it almost disappeared from academic psychology because if you start to look at all the different types of motivation, let's say intrinsic motivation is motivation that isn't related to external rewards. But intrinsic motivation can also be something that you do in order to achieve, or through affiliation, or for reasons of power, or is it something else? What we have in psychology is that I think that there is really a hypertrophy of the ego I've studied this and nobody's going to move me. So I don't get in touch with anybody else. And I don't try to organize even the vocabulary, not even the vocabulary. This goes on. Positive psychology. Before, it was in charge of happiness. And I have to say that I'm up to here with happiness. Up to here. Because, of course, if happiness is everything, well, is the child going to be happy? Well, let's see what we understand happiness to be. Because at times, we'll also have to justify that the child will also have to have a bit of a difficult time. Won't it? What happens when we have to set limits to the child? Are we attacking their happiness? Seligman got into all this, and he's a charming person and a person that played a fundamental role in psychology. And now he said that we've overdone it with happiness, and now we've moved on something else that's well-being. Well, another fashion, and what comes after a well-being? Why am I trying to make my indignation about this contagious? Because all these fashions move on to the education system, and they move on to the education system in an improvised, superficial and passionate manner, because we are passionate. And all of a sudden we realize, well, let's see. The success of things is often absolutely accidental. And Howard Gardner himself said that instead of saying multiple intelligence, he'd said, which would have been the logical thing, multiple skills. Nobody would have been interested. But he said, well, I thought of using the term multiple intelligence. And now we're all talking about, oh, multiple intelligence. And what's this? No, they're multiple skills. And they're multiple skills that the most advanced psychology we've had, San Juan in the 17th century, said, look, science has multiple skills, and we have to discover what they are in order to develop them. These people are extremely intelligent, but they get stuck on the same ground and repeat things over and over again. And they don't ask what's being done next door. How can I coordinate this with other things we know? How can we give an integrated view of human intelligence, which is what we need in education? I don't know what comes after this. Do we have any solutions? I think so. I think so, because we're starting to know a great deal about how we can provide an integrated education theory. And this is currently being done, but curiously, it's being done based on neurology. Some neurologists, specifically Antonio Damasio, and specifically Joaquin Fuster, let's see if it will listen to me from here. Oh, I have to point it at this. Aha. Finally. Psychology doesn't tell us anything about two essential things for education. Is man free? Can personalities be changed? Two relevant issues. The idea we have in psychology and also in neurology regarding human freedom is that it doesn't actually exist. Human intelligence is an intelligence that responds to many things, but it can't be said that it's free. And there are very powerful reasons to say they're right, even though I believe they're not right, but it's very difficult to say so. For example, One of the neurological experience that is most disquieting was done by Benjamin Libet initially, but since then it's been replicated a great deal. And it consists of the following. Some 200 milliseconds before I make the decision of making a movement, the premotor areas of the brain have been activated. In other words, the brain runs 200 milliseconds ahead of our capability to decide. So who decides? My brain or me? It's an important issue. And a new intelligence theory has to solve this, because we need to know whether our students are free or not. Personality, is it a stable style of response that lasts a whole lifetime? Some people say it is, and that it never changes. Through the theory we're working on, there are three kinds of personality. The inherited personality, which is temperament. And there's the learned personality, which is character. That can be educated. And there's the chosen personality, which is the life project I build with my character. And now we're saying, of course it's important to educate character. Of course it's important, but the Greeks already knew that. The word ethics comes from ethos, which means character. And what Aristotle said is what we have to focus education on is on educating character, which is the set of habits that a person acquires, and that is their second nature. So we have a vision of personality which is splendid for education. Children do things with their temperament. They modify it through their character, and they apply it through their life project. And therefore, what we have to do is how we can help them to consolidate that second nature. And what about freedom? Freedom isn't a capability that's standard. We learn to become free from many things, or we don't. And people are free that free themselves of more things. And for example, as we'll see, of temperament, of impulses. A person that doesn't learn to modulate their impulses, we can't say they're free. But impulses, we learn to modulate impulses. This is one of the executive functions we're studying. And we know what happens when a child doesn't learn to dominate their impulses. Of 12% of children at school age that are found to have impulse or attention deficits, 1.5% are disorders that have to be treated medically, and the rest are children that haven't learned to control their impulses. And in the education system, we need to know that has to be learned and has to be taught, because it forms part of the structure of intelligence. These are questions that I feel are important. Can we develop a unifying definition of intelligence? Yes. Which are the limits of learning? It seems to me that there are more than we thought, but they occur at two different levels. Is it possible to learn to be creative? Yes. Creativity is a habit that can be learned, like learning to play tennis. But isn't habit repetition? No, those are repetitive habits. Creative habits invent new things, but they are also learned habits. Well, what does it seem to me? Well, it doesn't seem to me. It seems to the whole team, and many of them are here. And I love to acknowledge the task they're doing. And since they've done it, I can show off because I'm part of the team. But I think that what we're doing is to develop a theory that doesn't go against everything else, but uses everything else. Because I think that we're very modest. We're very modest, and we're learning from everyone, and we're constantly learning from everyone. But with the idea that we need to unify all that knowledge within a model that is as consistent as possible, because we cannot develop a flight theory for the sparrow, for the ostrich, and for the aeroplane. It has to be valid for anything that flies. And in intelligence, we have to put things into an organized model. What are the fundamental principles of this? That what transforms human intelligence is the capability to self-regulate our own operations. This capability depends on the frontal lobes, and as you can see, the frontal lobes, they're in our forehead, they grow throughout animal evolution. And there are examples from the rat, the cat, the chimpanzee, and the human being, the area in red. And what is the function of this frontal lobe? While the rest of the brain picks up information, develops information, mixes up information, stores information, the frontal lobes direct the activity of the other lobes. They slow it down, they stimulate it, and this is where our peculiarity arises. Animals have an extremely powerful intelligence, but they can't direct it. It's directed by the programs they're born with, and they're really very powerful programs, but they can't direct things towards a target, all that enormous machinery. And yet that's what we do, and that's what children have to learn, because children, when they're born, they don't have very good command of their movements. They don't have a very good command over their nervous system, over their memory, over their motivations, over their feelings. And during that entire process, the executive and directive functions that were exercised initially by the mother, the main carer, the child will gradually internalize them and will end up directing himself in the same way that he was directed before, in collaboration with the mother. For example, I'm sure that you've all worked with an idea in language. And language is extremely important in this, because the increase in the regulating capability runs parallel to the symbolic and linguistic capability of the human being. And this is how it works. Let's see if you can still remember this from the time you were students. The language phenomenon includes an emitter, a receiver, and between the two, very good. Great. 10 out of 10. Why do we constantly speak to ourselves? Let's see, do you ask yourself questions? Yes. About a lot of things. Will I say I'm ill? Will I get married? Let's see, I want to ask questions. To who? To me. Who knows the answer? I do. Who am I going to tell? Me. And why that complication?
Sencilla. El niño.
The child learns how to manage its memory by answering questions that come from outside. And when this need, when he's sufficiently mature, he still manages his memory, but with questions that he asks himself. And the child learns how to obey external orders, not the first one, of course. And towards 5 or 6 years of age, he starts to give himself orders, and that is how we continue throughout our lives. And we can say that what we traditionally called will has to do with our capability to give ourselves orders and to obey these orders. And this in Greek is called autodamos. And this is what autonomy is all about, and this is the capability that a child has of learning to give itself orders and to obey them, because we are really taking a major evolutionary leap here. Because those things that come in the form of wishes and fears and dreams, well, they can be directed from the executive functions.
Ojalá de esta conferencia salierais teniendo este.
Let's only hope that you will remember this. I think it's the main take-home message, because I think that it's going to be the most important things in terms of research on intelligence and education in the next few years. But let's start from down below. Down below, there's intelligence. There's what we call generating or computing intelligence. And this is something that we share with animals. And what this does is it obtains information, it interprets information and organizes it and stores it away and eventually produces responses or answers. But what we do there is done in an unconscious manner. So, for instance, a very straightforward question for you. Have you been to the moon? No, of course not. Well, have you had any difficulties in answering this question? No, of course not. Well, that's because you're very clever guys. But anyway, this is something that you've done fairly quickly and in approximately 100 milliseconds. So, in other words, 1/10 of a second. But now comes the interesting question. But how did you do this? How did you know that you'd never been to the moon before? Did you do anything? Well, I'm sure that you were not aware of the fact that you did do something, but your brain certainly did it. But look, when we want a computer to perform this very straightforward operation, we have to give it a list of all those places we've already been. And then you have to introduce the term moon. So it's an operation that is done perfectly well that is called matching. And if you don't find any match, there's nothing there. So what have we done? We don't know. But we've had to do something that is very complex. It's very difficult. For example, I've written down 3 major systems that take place under the level of conscience, which is a cognitive system, a muscular system. And if I would ask you to stand up, you'd all stand up, of course. But you wouldn't have to consciously decide on which leg you were going to use first. So I tell you to stand up and your brain immediately decides if it's going to be the left or the right leg and how you're supposed to balance yourself. But we have all absolutely automatic motor skills that are implemented and they get it done. What about the affective systems? Why do we feel one thing or the other? Why is it that there are people that interpret everything as a threat? And why is it that there are people that do not, they are very brave? And why is it that there are depressive and optimistic individuals? Where does all of that come from? Well, this arises from this computational intelligence that interprets things according to these approaches. And these are things that we all learn. And they can be learned spontaneously, or we can teach them in an efficient manner from education. But what for? So that we can produce good feelings. And I was telling you before that our theory is much more powerful than emotional intelligence. And the thing that it says that, look, you feel afraid, and we're going to teach you how to control that fear. And no, we are further down. And that is the feeling of fear is a feeling that arises from the fact that in your computational intelligence, there's something that interprets everything as fear. But if you change that scheme, you will no longer feel afraid. So we are in a completely different division of learning, and we are now in the learning of all the functions, of all the schemas that are determining what we are thinking and what we feel. So what happens with all of this? Well, that a very small part of all of those things that we are doing, and this is for mathematicians, it is considered that the human brain per second is performing 10 to the minus 14 operations. And each operation involves information. 10 to the 14th is a lot of operations. and we don't exactly know how they are done. But a small portion that Eric Kandert, a Nobel Prize winner, says that 10%. And for instance, Michael Gazzanigan, who's a wonderful neurologist, says that at the most it's 2%, but both of them offer their own calculations because there's no way you could guess it properly. But a very small part of what we are doing jumps upwards. And this is what we call conscience. So a very tiny part of what we are doing moves on to a state of consciousness. And this is where we have the truly significant things. So as from that little element of consciousness, we have learned to direct, up to a certain extent, to direct whatever happens down below. Only up to a certain extent, of course, but this is up to a certain extent that is extremely powerful. So, for instance, okay, let's review what's been said. We have the non-conscious segment down below. And, for example, this is John Bach, who's one of the most outstanding and brilliant researchers in the issue of cognitive consciousness or unconsciousness that hasn't got to do with Freud. So this has nothing to do with Freud, and it's only the fact that our nervous system is working and performs operations without really knowing how they are done. And we only know a little bit about this. And John Baum is one of the researchers that we'll see is going to progress in the future. But the top part has to do with the executive side of things. And this is characterized by the fact that the targets are chosen. The importance of targets in education is absolutely fundamental. Why do you think that teaching by projects works? Well, because teaching by projects is adapted to the model of intelligence that if I were to address projects, it's something I organize all of my mental mechanics in order to gear that towards the project. And the project attracts me, and the project unifies motivation, and the project allows me to assess what it is I'm doing, because this is how intelligence operates. And this model, one which is conscious and the other one that is executive, right now there are lots of researchers that are very, very modern indeed who are focusing on this right now. For instance, Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner. And I would recommend this book that's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he considers that the unconscious thinking, the one down below, is very quick. But that is not completely clear. So therefore, this has to be subject to executive controls from the top level. And that we should say that occurrences come from the bottom, but criticism comes from the top. And with both things, this is what we can see. So I want to lose weight, for instance. I want to go on a diet. And executively, I take the decision of the fact that I'm going to stick to a diet. But our rotten intelligence down below says that it's wonderful to eat. It's a great enjoyment. But aren't you a fool if you don't eat, because you might die the day after tomorrow? And they'll probably discover that cholesterol is absolutely wonderful because it is continuously producing a number of thoughts, automatic thoughts, that I do not decide upon. I'd like to give you an example. Winter time. The alarm clock rings first thing in the morning, and the computational intelligence sets into motion and offers us a number of splendid reasons to not go to work. It's very cold outside, and yesterday I had a bit of a cold, and it's much better to prevent than to cure, or not going to work one day is much better than being sick for 1 week. And then from the executive level, that's it. Stop it. Get up now. And this is something that we can see every day. But the thing is that until now, we didn't know how this was organized, and now we know how things work out. Because this forms part of the constitution of our intelligence, and you have to learn about this because it's not supplied from the very beginning. And the theory that has been most important in education is the one from Jean Piaget, a delightful person who was very passionate. He was Well, it was a wonderful experience working with him, but he only dealt with cognitive intelligence, and he himself said that I've not dealt with emotions because not even I can understand them, nor have I dealt with control systems. And his theory has been very fragmented. It's nowadays extremely fragmented. And his disciple, Valery Nebler, says that no, well, we didn't know how to explain the control systems for intelligence properly. James Heckman is the Nobel Prize in Economic Science, like Kahneman, but he's placed in the sphere of education a fashion. Well, it's not a fashion. I hope that it's not only a fad, but this is also a fragment of the non-cognitive skills. And, well, within the theories of education, we have knowledge, without a doubt, but there's also something else that is much more important than knowledge, and this has to do with the non-cognitive skills. And all of these are executive skills, for example. And focusing your attention. Focusing your attention is an executive skill, or maintaining an effort, which is an executive function, or choosing your goals. And putting up with failures, well, this is also executive, and flexibility to change your targets if we're doing things wrong. This is another executive faculty. And metacognition, this is an executive function, and the impact that this has from the educational perspective is absolutely fabulous. But as soon as the child notices that he's managing his mental processes, his learning will improve. But Heckman had something else. Heckman had performed his economic research, and he demonstrated, and let's only hope that our politicians will bear this in mind, he said that the most profitable investment for a nation is the money spent in primary education. But then he was wondering, but why is this so important? And what he did was cover the entire documental series of some North American schools, the Perry schools. They are very good, and for many years they'd carried out the experience of attracting the children that came from very marginalized environments, and they put them into those schools and they took a look at the outcomes. And he studied how this worked out. And what he noticed is that there was not a significant improvement in terms of intelligence tests. However, the outcomes they had, the educational outcomes, and in the world of work, there was an absence of problems, and the outcomes were very significant. And he said, well, there's a factor here that it's not the factor that has to do with cognitive intelligence, because these are the non-communicative skills, in short, which we have. And we should know how to represent them. But there's a test that many of you possibly know. It's a lovely test, and it's been posted on YouTube. That's called the test of sweets, and it's been published in Spain, and it was published a short time ago, and it's called the test of the sweets, or the test of candies. And it's all about the following. And we do this on 5-year-old children. And we tell them, look, we're going to give you a cake, you can eat it, but if you don't eat that cake whilst I'm outside the classroom, when I come back, you can eat it and I'll give you another cake. So whoever's with them leaves the room and they're observed and filmed. And there are some children that eat the cake without taking the wrapping off. And there are others that don't want to eat the cake. But what they do is adopt very inefficient strategies. For instance, they sit very close to the cake and they look at it, they turn it around, they pick it up, they put it down, and they prod it with their finger. They take a little crumb and then 15 minutes later they eat it. But there are others that set into motion more efficient strategies, and the most frequent one, and it's very moving to see them, is that they cover up their eyes. Or they just walk around, or they start to sing. And they know that if they distract themselves, they're not going to eat the cake, which is what they want. This is executive intelligence, and my target is not to eat the cake, and how can I do this? But the interesting thing is that Walter Mischel, who did this research, has followed up these children for 30 years. And these results have been compared with another longitudinal study in New Zealand that he's followed up for other reasons. So, in other words, nothing is predetermined. And what he has noted is that the outcome of this very straightforward test forecasts the entire evolution of the child in 30 years, academically speaking, in his relationship with society. It also has to do with the absence of problems and with his position on the job, much better than the intelligence tests. So, in other words, what we're saying here is that here there's an interesting issue to be borne in mind. And because what we can see is that the intelligence of the child can be very significant, but if the child does not have these self-regulation systems, just remember what I was pointing out at the beginning, that self-regulation of intelligence is much more fundamental than your coefficient, your intelligence coefficient, and this is a very clear-cut evidence. But we should not be influenced by the pendulum, because we have to strengthen the non-cognitive skills as well as the cognitive skills too. And there's another important thing, which is what we're currently looking in. This has to be done through the curriculum. If not, it'll be of no use whatsoever, because we cannot multiply more things. No, we have to do this through the curriculum, and we have to draw up a curriculum for primary education, for kindergarten, and we have to introduce this in the kindergarten curriculum, primary and secondary education curricula, which is the task we are currently doing and which I believe has advanced quite a lot. And then the third is Antonio Damasio, who has theory of intelligence from a neurological perspective that I would recommend, and it's called The Brain Created Man. And it's very easy to read, a very quick read. And then I was interested in what we have on artificial intelligence that runs along the same lines. For example, we have the supervisory attentional system, the SAS, which is the executive system. But this comes from the world of artificial intelligence. And then we have the programs. We have chess play programs. You know that Leoncho Garcia is now in another room. So I'm working with Leoncho on something that attracted our attention, which was that everybody says, and there is evidence of the fact that it seems to confirm this, and that is that intelligence games develop certain skills in the child. That is more attention, reasoning, better reading skills. However, we do have a problem from the point of view of the learning sciences, and that is that we are not very sure about transferring one skill to another. So it's not at all clear that the capability of reasoning in chess can be applied to other fields, because somebody might reason perfectly well in mathematics but be absolutely hopeless in terms of politics. Well, because the rational systems usually depend on the domain involved. So there's an issue that I was very interested in, which it seems that does improve these skills. But how does this transfer occur? Well, this is a transfer that does not occur at the level of our reasoning, but it rather happens at the level of executive functions. So whatever strengthens the fact that you play chess has to do with the executive functions in activating the brain or in activating your efforts, motivation, controlling emotions, inhibiting impulses, and the capacity to redirect your thoughts. And these are executive functions. And of course, if I am going to work that way, this is going to improve all of the outcomes of my intelligence. But of course, this provides us with pedagogical tools that are absolutely colossal, because not only that, we also have identified 11 executive functions. And I'm sure that I will not list all 11, but anyway. The first one is that you have to activate the brain. If you do not activate the brain, you're never going to learn. And here, well, there are some studies from a wonderful neurologist from the IT, Rosalímpica, and I'm afraid to say this as a teacher, but the activity of the brain of a student when he's in the classroom is much better than when that brain is asleep. And I'm sorry that I have to say this, but anyway. But everybody knows that the first thing we have to do for a student to be able to learn is we have to place them in a state of activation. So this is why we have to spend the first 2 or 3 minutes to waking up the student. Well, please understand what I mean to say, that they put their brain into the activity mode, and this is preparing them for the learning process, because if not, they will not pay any attention whatsoever. I could give you the neurological reasons, but I won't right now. And by the way, let's only hope that this were a starting point for all of us and not only just something transitional. But I would like to open a discussion on this subject. I'm afraid that we can't hold it here because we don't have enough time. But I would like to make a little remark. I would like to discuss this issue. I'm going to give you my email and I will answer you if you ask me questions. It's jmarina@telefonica.net. I think that we are facing a crucially important moment, and I think that this is something that we can apply at our schools in September, and it's a shame if we don't do so. But going back to where I was, and I don't know where I was exactly, where was it? Oh, yeah. Well, yes, activating the brain. That's it. Yeah. Well, this is included within a major module, which is the module of how I set the brain into motion. And there we have activation, and there we have controlling attention, and there we have controlling motivation, as well as emotional control. And all of these are the major module of let's get cracking, let's start to work. And then we have the second module is, okay, now we're going to set things into motion. And what we have to do is establish another essential executive function, which is controlling our impulses. Impulsive children don't learn. And when you probably noticed that there are a number of diffuse disorders amongst your students, and these are children with attention deficits, but they also have a sort of emotional disturbance. They change their moods a lot, and they're also impetuous, and they are also hyperactive, whereas other children are not. And these children that are dyslexic, but apart from that, they also have learning difficulties, or they find that it's difficult to control their movements. But what we are seeing right now is that these symptoms, these so dispersed symptoms, are so because all of them are disorders that affect the executive functions and which manifest themselves differently. And if we were to change the executive functions, or if we were to improve the executive functions, we would also improve the symptoms. Therefore, we are using new tools, very powerful tools, and this has to do with language. But why is it that those children that are aggressive in a very large percentage find that they have language difficulties? Because what they have are difficulties in the executive functions that regulate action and that also regulate their language. And if we manage to organize all of these things, we'll make the child progress in a very rapid fashion. And we don't really have to do anything different. It's all about doing what the good teachers were doing without really noticing it. Do you remember that character of Molière who used prose without being aware of the fact? Well, some of the teachers are educating the executive functions without being aware of the fact. But now we have a model and we can check whether we're doing it or we're not. And the action mode is inhibiting impulses, and it's all about setting targets, and it's all about organizing actions to achieve these targets. And in the case of very disorganized children, for instance, dyslexic children forget many things and they lose lots of things too. And why do these children lose lots of things? Well, if you've noticed some the smaller children, how they dress up, they're absolutely chaotic. They put on one sock, and then they put the underpants on, and then their shirt, and then their cap, and then the other sock, and then the shoes, if they remember, of course. But what's going on? Well, now we know that one of the executive functions that has to do with this is that they do not perceive the spatial sequence nor the time sequence properly. Hyperactive children, well, children with attention deficit are not aware of what the future is going to be like. And this is why they plan things very poorly. And, well, this has got nothing to do with attention. This has to do with executive functions. Executive functions are those that allow you to anticipate the future. So we have impulse control, establishment of targets, organization of actions, and then flexibility, because perhaps you have to change your targets, and there are children that do not change actions. And perseverance in their actions, well, it becomes pathological because they're going to continue doing the same thing. Autistic children, for instance. Autism is a disease that affects the executive functions. So they have repetitive behaviors that are completely and absolutely repetitive. And this is a pathology. But there are children that, well, any change in their routine produces such a high level of anguish that what we know that this function of flexibility is what has to be developed properly. And then the next one has to do with maintaining efforts. Well, this is an executive function that has to be educated, that has to be taught. And the next one, which is extremely important, but which is another module, one of the characteristics that we have is that computational intelligence, in other words, the basement or the ground floor, learns spontaneously, and everybody learns spontaneously. So we remember certain things, we have experiences that we would like to forget, but we cannot. But from the top floor, we can do something different. In other words, we can decide, look, this is what I really want to learn about. So I can say, look, tomorrow at 5 minutes past 10, I'm going to start learning Chinese. And that means that I don't know how my memory functions, but I can give it orders. And this is what we call an executive function, which is the work memory, has to decide what it is I want to put away in my memory in the long term. This is an executive function, but this has to do with how I organize my memory. And what I have to do is decide how I'm to do the search in the memory. Searching in one's memory is a function that uses up lots of energy, and this is why our students do not search in their memories. We ask them a question, and if they cannot think of an answer immediately, what do they say? I don't know. And many times they do have the answer, but the fact that you're searching in your memory is a function that takes a big effort, so we have to train ourselves. And this is an executive function. And the final thing is metacognition. And how can I discover if the information that I'm using is connected to targets or not? Executive habits are habits that have to do with metacognition, because I'm going to organize the information, and sometimes rationally and sometimes creatively. For what? So that in order to see if I'm capable of attaining a target. But why? Well, because in this, like in everything else, what executive intelligence does is transform those operations that we used to do in a spontaneous manner, and those that are done by animals. Do animals think? Yes, of course they think. For example, let's just imagine an eagle who from the top of a cliff sees a rabbit and decides as a target that he wants to hunt that rabbit. So what he has to do is compute information, very complex information, and until this point in time we do not have a computer that is able to do so, because this has to do with how the bird has to organize its muscles and see how he should make use of the air drafts or the air currents, and see what the angle of incidence is supposed to be like to catch the rabbit and not just crash against the ground, and see what has to be done should his flight have to be modified when he's following the rabbit. Well, all of this is about computing information, so it's about thinking, but not in a conscious manner. But what we can do is say, oh yes, I'm going to do something like this, but I'm going to do so consciously. I'm going to organize all the information, and then those, which is what thinking is all about. It's all about organizing information coherently to achieve a target. That's what thinking is all about. So I'm going to do this, and many times it's muscular thought, sometimes it's conceptual thought, other times it's affective thought. It's I'm going to organize information. So when I'm doing this, I'm teaching children to think. I'm going to finish. Can we extend children's intelligence? Yes. And what about adults? Yes. It's a little bit more difficult, but equally so. But how can we do this? By extending the intelligence of the individual through occurrences, or by reinforcing the executive functions. From what do we get from the ground floor? The good ideas come from there, fundamentally from a memory that produces things. Can we organize that memory? Yes, of course we can organize that memory. Should we do it? Yes. Do we know how to do it? Yes, we do know how to do it. Are we going to do it? I think that we are not going to do it. Anyway, unless I manage to convince you. So this is something that we can do. But how can you extend memory? Well, through a procedure that the brain has that is absolutely colossal, because the brain wants to save energy. So whatever is done from the top floor is very exhausting for us. And it has a very limited amount of space. The magic number, which is 7 plus minus 2 things happening at the same time, and we don't go beyond that. And neither do our students. Even though they do lots of things at the same time, they don't. They jump from one thing to another. And we have that which is very tiring. But what is the solution? Well, you have to make it automatic. And making it automatic means that when I manage, when there was something that I did with lots of attention, therefore with lots of energy expenditure, if I make it automatic, it doesn't waste any energy, and I can use that energy for something else. And remember what happened to you when you were learning to drive. And well, nobody had enough attention to pay to the clutch, to the accelerator, and to the brakes. Too many things. But when that process became automatic, it's easy, and now we can talk on the mobile phone, which is something that you shouldn't do when you're driving. So once you automate something, we do so without wasting any energy. But how can you do that? Through training. Is Zubizarreta there? Because he knows a lot about that. But why is it that I'm giving you, as an example, coaches a lot? Well, because they manage to extend the capabilities of their athletes, and they make many things automatic, and they implement these routines that allow them to get things done. But we can do this. Well, one of the biggest, or some of the biggest mathematical discoveries, the mathematicians said that we did this without really knowing how we did it. How strange. No, well, they had done it with the very complex mathematical systems that they'd automated. So whenever we make a child acquire a certain habit, for better or for worse, we are increasing the way they do things. There are things that extend intelligence and others that do not. But why? Because we are downloading onto the executive system, we are downloading energy expenditure, and the maximum example of this is language, because all the work that has to be done to learn a new language is, well, one of the most complex things that we're ever going to learn. And there's a mathematical axioma from the world of pedagogy. Whoever's been able to learn to speak is capable of doing anything, because never are you going to learn anything as complex as a language. And if you don't learn it, it's because of some other reason. But I think that this model is going to awaken a great deal of interest, and I have lots of hopes for it in the world of education, and I would like to continue talking about it. We can continue through the internet, so I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.